Today's guest is someone who's not just talking about imposter syndrome, she's dismantling it at its core. Dr. Tara Halliday is a leading expert neuroscience-based coach and the best-selling author of Outsmart Imposter Syndrome and Unmasking, the Coach's Guide to Imposter Syndrome. With over 2 decades of experience helping high performers reclaim their confidence, Tara brings a unique blend of science, strategy, and soul. If you've ever felt like a fraud despite your success, this episode is for you. Welcome to the EOR podcast. This term, imposter syndrome, has come up a lot in this past year, not only for myself, and we're going to get into that a little bit deeper, and maybe do a quick analysis of my problems, but just hearing it from so many different influencers and psychologists and people in the health and wellness industry, and it's become ubiquitous, the term imposter syndrome. And I thought that this was something that may have been coined in the last decade. And then I did my research and realized that this goes back to the 1970s. And a couple of psychologists that decided to do a study, and primarily, and it sounds like, and maybe I'll let you explain this better, primarily for young women. It sounded like it was gender specific at the time. Obviously, it's grown to be both, but very gender specific at the time because they were finding that young girls, young women, were experiencing one of two patterns. And the interesting thing about that story, when I read through the research and what they were trying to determine, is when I started the effort over results philosophy and how I believe in praising children, employees, students, athletes for their efforts as opposed to focusing solely on results, I realized that these two things are very closely intertwined. And my daughter, and this is now going back to the research from the 70s, I realized that we spent the better part of my daughter's first 15, 20 years saying to her how great she was and how smart she was and how athletic she was. And I believe that she has formed this imposter syndrome within herself because she got to a point where she couldn't respond to adversity, where if she didn't succeed, she had failed. She did not have a growth mindset. She had a fixed mindset. And it was just so interesting to read this research and get into it. So let me ask you this question. What inspired you to start thinking about what imposter syndrome is, and where was that within your career? Because obviously, both of us, there came a point where we became somewhat enthralled with a particular topic. So when did this start for you? And does that resonate with what I'm saying?
Yes, it does, and I can go into into certainly how historically it's moved from thinking it's just women to understanding it's both.
Hmm.
Um, I was working on what has turned out to be, which was my light bulb moment, the root cause of imposter syndrome. And I was doing specific coaching work around that. And one of my clients asked me, is this imposter syndrome? Which I, at the time, hadn't heard of. So I went and researched it. And then it was like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. All the symptoms of conditional worth, which is what I to talk about, is exactly the same as symptoms of imposter syndrome. I found the root cause, which is really exciting. And my work has just been to really focus on how to systematically address that and had great success in that. So yeah, it's all
For people who don't, may not have heard the term, and it's like I said before, it feels like everybody understands this term or at least has heard this term.
yeah.
But I'm sure there are people out there who are listening who are intrigued by this and want to learn more about it. But how do you explain imposter syndrome in a simpler term that doesn't have a psychological explanation or definition to it? Simplify it for us, Tara.
Yeah, so imposter syndrome is the secret feeling of being a fraud when you're not a fraud,
Hmm.
and the fear of being found out. It's a feeling that you don't belong, or that you're not quite good enough. And it affects 70% plus of high achievers. So this isn't people who are beginners. This is people who are already externally successful, and they know logically that they're capable and competent, but internally they're not feeling it. So there's this disparity. So you've got their outer success and their inner success. They're not feeling it.
So how is this not something that basically everybody can feel?
Um,
Who wouldn't
if you
feel this?
Well, there's a few. So, for few people whose brains are, not quite there. There are people who are not quite um, whole, if you like,
Okay.
and so no, I'll go into it. Sociopaths and psychopaths
Okay.
who don't have connections in their brains to the fear center in their brain, so they won't feel it. But also, they're not feeling a whole load of emotional range within their lives either. So it's not a positive thing for them. And then some people who haven't challenged themselves enough, which you could say is a little bit imposter syndrome. It's almost like a fear of success. And if I get successful, then people are going to expect more of me, so I just won't. So I'll hold back.
Mm,
Or the thing that's causing imposter syndrome, the root cause of imposter syndrome, might be focused somewhere else. So in high achievers, your identity is very much tied with your work. Right. The conditional worth belief is your worth as a human being depends on what you do. Yeah, and we put those two together like that. So we don't say we say I am a doctor instead of I do doctoring. So it's that action versus identity, if you like. And for some people, their identity is not tied up with their work or not strongly tied up with their work. So when we see it in successful people, it's because they've tied their identity um, to their worth, or their worth to their work identity.
I feel like, and psychopaths and sociopaths aside, that everybody at some point in life ties their identity to the what they've been doing for an extended period of time. So a good example of this would be for myself, being an athlete and growing up in an athletic family and performing in sports and then performing in high level collegiate university sports and then playing professional. When I eventually hung up my cleats, so to speak, and retired from the sport, I believe I suffered from that lack of identity. Um,
Yeah.
and I didn't know how to manage that during the first few years of retirement out of the sport. Um, Eventually it went by the wayside because I had children shortly after, and then my identity changed there and I became a father. And it's interesting, Tara, because in this past few years, now that my children have grown up and now they're out of the house and they're 20 plus years old and living their own lives, I now am suffering from lack of identity as a father. We all remain parents, but I'm just saying I don't need to be driving my kids to sports and school and everything and being that father figure. And so I lack that identity now. And now my life is okay, what is my next identity? So let's speak to that. Let's speak to identity and once again how tightly knit and close knit this is to the imposter syndrome, because I believe it plays a really big part, no?
Well, back in the 1950s, one of the grandfathers of personal psychology, Dr. Carl Rogers, after he'd worked with thousands of people and taught thousands more, um, he decided he wanted to find what was the root cause of human suffering, or conversely, the root cause of human happiness. But in terms of suffering, why, when we've got, food, shelter, clothing, safety, why are people still miserable? And he found that answer. And he found that answer to be that we set like an ancient meme, an ancient mental virus that everybody has, that our worth depends on what we do. So if we do something good, we are good. If we do something bad, we are bad. And he said this was 99.99% of people all over the globe. So it's that pervasive. And you can see it everywhere. We say it with our children. They do something well, and they get praise. We even say to the dog, good dog, bad dog.
Yeah.
It really is everywhere. We ask children what um, what they want to be when they grow up, rather than what they want to do when they grow up. So it really, that tying um, your worth to what you do is everywhere. And then when you step into adulthood, you're looking for this sense of, well, who am I then? And the only place that we find it is in what we do. So you mentioned this change of sense of identity. There's certain transitions that people do go through. So retirement, whether it's from a particular career like you had, or at the end of your entire working life, when you become a parent, when your children leave home, we've got terms for it. Empty nester syndrome, midlife crisis, and all of that. So it's the echoes of it are absolutely everywhere. But the couple of researchers back in the 1970s identified specifically what they called then imposter phenomenon, which is now what we're calling imposter syndrome. And that's that sense that no matter how hard we try, we're not quite good enough. And there's always this sense that we should be doing more, we could be doing more, we don't quite fit, we don't quite belong. And it drives all sorts of patterns. There's all sorts of symptoms in that.
You're when I say you're speaking my language, I mean you're speaking my life. I have felt probably from my adolescent years through my teens and then through to adulthood, this feeling of this imposter syndrome as we define it today, in that I never and I wow, we're gonna get into a real therapy session here. Um, what I felt was growing up in a family with no money, on social assistance, and trying to sort of hide that from my friends. But then I was relatively good in school. I was a good athlete. I always had this feeling of, how did I make it here? And that to me sort of is almost the layman working man's term of imposter syndrome, is almost like, how did I get here? And that's something that I've felt throughout my entire life. Even today as we're speaking, I feel like, I'm doing this podcast, I'm trying to build a brand and a company, and it's like, how did I even get to this point? And is that a really basic, simple way to describe imposter syndrome for a lot of people, is that feeling of, how did I get here?
Yeah, definitely. So there are three groups of symptoms for imposter syndrome. One's the
Mm.
thoughts that we have, thoughts and feelings we have. One's our physiological response to it, stress response, and then the third is a whole bunch of behaviors that we can get into. What you're talking about is the thoughts. So people feel like they're lucky. It just got there by accident. I just happened to be there, and it wasn't really due to me. Or people think that well, they overthink, or they're very self-critical, and so and they feel that sense of, as I said, not being quite good enough, and that how did I get here is really not owning or recognizing the work that you've put into it. So your podcast, wonderful title, effort over results. It's not acknowledging the effort that you've made. You see results, and the results are maybe bigger than you might have expected, right? Which in some way might be very pleasing, but it can be startling. Maybe I haven't quite earned it. And you see this at, the top of corporate levels. I get a very good salary. How did that happen? I don't, yeah. And the pressure then comes in, this sense of expectation. And even if you've done something well, the pressure is, well, maybe you can't do it next time. And I do believe this is something you do see in sports. You might have a fantastic game and, be carried around on people's shoulders. And at the back of your mind is, well, what if I can't do it next time?
Mm.
What they're gonna realize that was just a fluke, and then they're gonna fire me or put me on the benches.
Hmm. Um, so I have so many questions now. Um, is the opposite then? So in the throes of imposter syndrome, one might feel like, how I this is all luck. How did I get here? Is the opposite of that short of hubris, is the opposite of that, I deserve this? Meaning, like, does that become the opposite then of imposter syndrome, where someone feels like, I put in the work, I deserve this? Or is that part of the therapy to help someone realize the work they have put in and how they have earned the position that they're in? How do you balance those two?
Yeah, so I do get this question sometimes. Is the opposite of imposter syndrome, which is self-doubt, is it arrogance?
Yeah,
That
right,
you think you're more than you actually are. You actually don't deserve the accolades you get.
right.
Actually, those are both the sets, the same kind of, opposite sides of the same coin, really. Um, the cure, if you like, the solution to imposter syndrome is a deep level of self-acceptance.
Mm,
And that with self-acceptance, it means you take ownership and you recognize the work that you've done, and you feel, yeah, that was good. You can pat yourself on the back and say, that's a job well done. I worked for this qualification. I worked for that project. And without it, and it actually makes you very humble, because you can see yourself so clearly with crystal clarity that, here's the work you've done, and here's other people's contributions, and all of that is okay. It leads to, when you've got this level of deep self-acceptance, it leads to a level of effortless confidence.
mm,
So you don't have to stand in the mirror and tell yourself, pep talk,
yeah.
you're great and you're gonna have a great day, and you just forget to doubt yourself, and that's what it brings up.
Mm. So when you get someone to recognize, and let me walk you through this. When you get someone to recognize the amount of effort, and I love how this ties into effort over results. This is beautiful. But when you get someone to recognize the amount of effort that they put in to getting to where they are today, let's say, and their response to you is, but I don't feel like that was enough. I still don't feel like I deserve to be here. Like there should have been more work involved for me to get to where I am. And once again, I'm speaking from experience. There's a lot of times, and maybe that's where natural talent comes in, where natural intellect comes in, where there are some people who just can walk onto the pitch, walk onto the field, and just be naturally good at something. Same thing in the business world and what have you. But what do you tell someone who continues to deflect the amount of effort they put in to get to where they are by saying, yeah, but I still don't think it was enough. I really still I don't believe I should be here.
Right, right. Well, that again comes to one of the behavioral symptoms of imposter syndrome.
Mm,
So, imposter syndrome, the stress of it on a physiological level, leads you to these coping behaviors, and one of those is perfectionism. One of those is, you've played a great game, and the only thing you can think about is that one pass that you missed.
mm,
Right? And the whole of all of that work that you did isn't there. So perfectionism. Others are procrastinating, over preparing, feeling like you need one more extra qualification, and you'll finally feel that you deserve it, finally feel good enough. You might not speak up for yourself enough. You might avoid opportunities. Who am I to be doing this? And so those are all behaviors. So that what you're describing there is part of the perfection behavior. And so you've got these three groups of symptoms. And so to deal with imposter syndrome, we don't deal with the symptoms, we deal with the root cause.
mm,
So systematically, we can go through and change the way that your brain interprets the world around you, and such that it's okay for you to be exactly where you are, and not have this expectation that you should do more. So the symptoms fall away when you address the root cause.
I was listening to Stephen Bartlett's podcast, Diary of a CEO,
Yeah.
and a guest he had on said that perfectionism is procrastination disguised as quality control. And I had to pause the podcast and run that through my mind a few times, and I went, he's basically exposed thousands of people who call themselves perfectionists, but really it's like we've been discussing in the last couple minutes, it's procrastination but disguised as quality control. And I go back to something you said, and it reminds me of my sporting career, where even after we had won a championship game or a big game, I was still going back through the game film to see where I could have done better. And this is all kind of tying together. So thank you for helping me understand that. I want to go touch upon something you said a couple minutes ago about root cause. Let's dig into that, because once again, I truly believe that in business, in life, we tend to focus on the symptoms.
Mhm.
And I always use the analogy. It's like, the knee pain I'm having isn't knee pain, it's actually hip and back problems that's causing the knee pain. What are the root causes that we can get to that might assuage multiple symptoms, because it is truly the root cause of all these other things we're feeling. So dig into that a little bit more about how we focus more on the root cause and how you can help people start to turn away from the feeling of imposter syndrome.
Well, so this is actually the work that I do. This is the whole work that I do
Mm,
with my clients. And the root cause of imposter syndrome is that belief that our actions and our worth are combined, right? And the way to get rid of that is to separate the two. Now, it's an unconscious belief. It's so pervasive in society, we don't even recognize it when we're comparing ourselves to other people and looking at the differences and feeling bad about the differences. We just don't recognize it.
mm,
So what we do instead, we've got a three-step path. First, you've got to get yourself calm. Calm the nervous system. When you calm the nervous system, then your brain's working at full capacity, because when it's triggered, it's absolutely not. Fight, flight, and freeze. Your IQ drops by 13 points. Your creativity drops by 50%. You can't make such good decisions. When fight, flight, and excuse me, I'll go off into a tangent here, but with fight, flight, and freeze even, the physiological response is to change the blood flow in your body. So you get more blood flowing to your arms and legs to allow you to take action and survive, protect yourself. One of the areas it takes blood from is the prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of your brain, which is the logical, strategic thinking, planning part of your brain. It's the emotional regulation part of the brain. So when you're triggered, you're reactive and you can't make good decisions. The very first thing is to get calm. When the brain is calm, then you can start to change it. So then the change is to change that belief. And I've got a very systematic way to change the belief, step by step way. And then from that, you can create really what you want in your life without you've cleared away the block that's holding you back. You've cleared away that belief that you're not quite good enough, and you have this deep self-acceptance. And from there, so than being driven by what you haven't achieved, you start to be inspired by what you could achieve. Things become an adventure. Things become oh, what if I try that? Right? An opportunity rather than, oh, I couldn't possibly, which is the other side of it.
does that connect to Dr. Carol Dweck's growth mindset? And I'm not sure if you're familiar, I'm sure you're familiar with it, but it's the concept of people with a growth mindset love challenges. They love to try new things because they're not afraid of failure, because they don't see failure as failure. They see it as an opportunity to learn from the mistake. And that's what it sounds like you're trying to teach here, is that people need to not be afraid to step outside their boundaries, to step outside their identity, to try new things, new challenges, because it actually helps them grow. And it's funny you mentioned the prefrontal lobe. It's like, I remember hearing about the anterior mid-cingulate cortex, and having us understand that the more challenging things you do, the more that grows, and your brain wants to continue to do more. It wants to eat more, so to speak. Does that all connect?
It's similar. Certainly, Carol Dweck's work is it's got some similar lines to it, but absolutely in terms of when you are freed from this idea that your worth is conditional, depends on what you do,
Yeah.
then you automatically have a growth mindset. It blossoms out
Right.
of it. It's not that you're trying to do it. One of the problems that I see with quite a lot of literature around the growth mindset, it says, well, stop fearing this and don't do this and avoid.
Yeah.
And for me, the question is, well, how? Come on, what's the details? Before I was a therapist and a coach, I was in an engineering career.
Mhm.
And it was very practical, very science-based, and very like, okay, what's the solution, right? Even, what is the solution? How, step by step? And what we're doing, going a little bit deeper, there is a part of the brain called the amygdala, which is on both sides of your head, and it's called the fear center of the brain. Basically, it's the watchdog. It's like your email virus checker, right? All of your emails go through that virus checker, and if it finds one, it highlights it and does something different. So the amygdala, its job is to look out for danger, look
Mm.
out for things that will threaten your survival, and when it finds it, anything that it thinks is a danger, it will trigger that fight, flight, or freeze response for you to protect yourself. That's how our brains are supposed to work. That's how human beings have survived this long. Um, with what we're doing in terms of growth mindset and imposter syndrome, the what the brain is looking out for is potential dangers where we don't belong, where we're not good enough. Because in caveman times, if you weren't considered worthy by your group, then you'd be thrown out the tribe, and you wouldn't survive because you need to be in a group to survive. So it's a very primal thing. So what we're doing in order to get the deep self-acceptance is we're systematically removing some of the triggers that are in your amygdala unconsciously that make you that trip your brain into fight, flight, and freeze. So can you see how this is like a really deep fundamental level that we're addressing things? And this sounds like it's therapy work, but it's absolutely not. Only in really the last 10 to 15 years have scientists been able to understand how we can change the amygdala, how we can change these triggers. And there's a very particular process that we go through that stimulates particular neurochemicals, which will allow the amygdala to change because it has to continue to learn what new threats are. So, using that same process of the way the amygdala works, we can deliberately stimulate these neurochemicals and change the emotional tone of a particular memory such that when we think about it again, it doesn't trigger us. So, for example, if you had, say, someone, oh, way, way back, made a certain comment about any part of what you did,
Mm.
and it was very hurtful at the time, it would have lodged in the brain as that's a threat because you're being rejected here or criticized here. And then if we remove that trigger, you can think about it again, but it no longer causes you to react. You don't go when you think about something long gone. And it means when something similar comes up, you don't react. This is what changes everything.
Mm. I was going to give you a great example. When I was hired for my most recent career position, and now it's been 15 years in this position, my brother said to me, quote unquote, "How did you fall ass backwards into that job?" And that, I think, is almost the epitome of what you're telling me right now. Is someone said something that was triggering, that questioned my worth or my ability
Mhm.
in the moment. And when he said it, I kind of sat back and went, "Yeah, how did I?" Like, not in front of him, but in my brain, I did.
Yeah.
And I have I eventually now, 15 years later, have, because I've been in the position and been successful in the position for 15 years, I've been able to ignore that comment from 14 years ago. But that to me sounds like what you're talking about. I wanna focus on something that is very powerful. You said, we believe our worth is conditional. And I think that is something that is, um it just seems to be part of growing up. Like, and I go back to my childhood, and now I'm a Generation X, but my childhood in the 1970s and 80s, and how, yes, our worth was tied to how do we contribute to society? How are we doing in school? How are we, contributing? And we all, based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we all want to be part of something and feel like we belong to something, right?
Mhm.
And so we try to find ways to fit in, and we will change who we are to try and fit into a particular group because we feel that will bring more self-worth, will bring more, um maybe notoriety is not the right term. So I want to ask you, how do you see imposter syndrome presenting itself in children? And have you worked with young people on this, or is this something that is generally reserved for adults who now have, gone into a career, or, into later stages of life? But how does this affect children? And have you seen studies or done research, or even worked with children on imposter syndrome?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I'm gonna go a little way the back. So the imposter syndrome, or rather the belief that your worth is conditional,
Hmm.
it's something that happens between the ages of 18 months and 3 years old.
Hmm.
And that's a developmental process. Before 18 months old, the baby's brain is just taking in all information, but it's got no structure to it, no framework, it's not interpreting anything. When it gets to round about 2, it starts to identify itself, right? I am separate. I'm not the dog. I'm not the table. I'm not my parents. I'm not my siblings. And that sense of identity is a natural part of a child's development. At that point would have been the ideal time to separate the idea that our worth depends on what we do, but we don't get taught it. So it's not that imposter syndrome and this belief on worth is conditional. It doesn't come from any trauma or bad parenting or a horrible childhood or anything like that. It comes because we just weren't at that moment taught that actually these things are separate, and so we carried it with us. So these events that you mentioned, say, for example, when you were told, "How did you fall back into that job?"
Hmm.
Right? That didn't cause imposter syndrome, but that event reinforced the idea that your worth is conditional.
Hmm.
And so this is what so children will be getting all these reinforcements as they grow up. Um, in answer to your question about who do I work with, I don't work with children.
Hmm.
The average age of the people I work with is 45. Yeah, I work with executives and business owners,
Yeah.
and those are the ones who notice imposter syndrome more because they have this level of success and this self-doubt, which as children and even, in your 20s, people put down to, well, I'm a beginner. If I just get more experience, then this feeling will go away. And by the time they get into their 30s, they're realizing, well, it hasn't gone away. If I just grit my teeth and get the next step in my career and what I'm doing, then I maybe, hopefully, will start to. By the time they get to their 40s and 50s, they realize that this pattern isn't going away. And they're finding that it's influencing their ability to perform at their best. Because you look at procrastination, over preparing, perfectionism, avoiding opportunities, not speaking up. All of these things affect your ability to perform at your very, very best. And so so that's the age that people really start to notice it. When you're younger, it's blurred with, well, do I feel uncomfortable because I'm just a beginner? Right? We can't separate it out. It's only till we realize later, well, I'm no longer a beginner and I'm still feeling this way.
So I've got a couple questions, and I want to try to figure out how to best make this timeline work. When you're working with executives, um, do you find, and I go back to the 1978, this 1970 studies, Dr. Clancy and Iams, when they were focusing primarily, at least at the start, on females. Okay. Uh, do you find today imposter syndrome more prevalent in males than females, or the opposite, or is it equal?
Lovely question. Okay, you're absolutely right. 1978, the Council Arms study was on graduate female students, and they found that women had imposter syndrome much more than the men did. And then after that, there were quite a number of studies done in research. We seek to replicate the results to prove them, and they found this same pattern. In the mid 90s, there was a study done where the survey used, it wasn't in person, it was completely confidential, absolutely anonymous. When that happened, the numbers come out equal.
Mm,
So all these studies, in the 10, 15 years before that had captured it's a women's trend, had actually captured a society trend where men are less willing or less allowed to express what they perceive to be a weakness. It's culturally not done, and that's globally. And even from the 70s to now, it's still a bit of a challenge. So now more studies have been done, and it's recognized that men and women get it equally. And when we look at the root cause, there's no gender in the root cause, so that makes sense. In terms of the work that I do, because I work with executives, I see more men than women because the demographic is there's more men in that at that level than women. So that also makes sense to
yeah.
me.
That too will change over time as well. I believe we're moving more towards a 50-50, executive level for men and women.
Yeah.
Um, does so let's stick with the people and the age level and demographics you work with, and the imposter syndrome in their work, let's say, being executives. Is it fair to say then that that imposter syndrome feeling tends to bleed into their everyday life as well, or is it something that is specific only to their success as a business owner, entrepreneur, executive leader?
Yeah, well, I think it bleeds in definitely, but in several different ways. Firstly, the stress levels that it creates, this constant triggering by the amygdala, not good enough, not good enough. The constant nagging creates levels of stress and tension. It affects sleep quality, and so it means when they do go home to their families, they're not relaxed, they're still tense. Maybe they can't switch off. And then some of the behaviors like over preparing and procrastination, that makes you less efficient, takes more time. Perfectionism takes more time. So people spend longer, they're less efficient and spend longer working, and that affects their time again with the family. And again, so they can't switch off. So everybody feels it. And of course, then in terms of the thoughts, we teach our children what we believe. And so we model for them, a high stress self-criticism, perfectionism, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And so they, they learn it as well. So the ripple effect is huge in terms of, it affects your relationships. You're less present, and you've got less patience because you're stressed. It really is a big deal for everyone.
It's interesting what you said about when doctors, clients, and IMS, started this study of university students, female university students in the 70s, and then obviously this has grown, and they weren't necessarily studying males, but but like you said, in the 1970s, males didn't admit to these sorts of things.
Mm.
It's just part of the persona and part of the gender identity of, we don't show weakness, we don't show vulnerability, and then obviously now that has been opened up. I work with a client that and this probably is a good example of what you were just saying. We had planned a golf day together, me and a few of the other CEOs that I work with, and the day had been rained out, and so we sat in the lounge and we were having a coffee, and we're discussing things, and we had planned a full 6 hour day together, and within an hour he's checking his watch and he's looking at his phone and checking his watch and looking at his phone, and I turned to him and I said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Do you need to go somewhere?" And he goes, "If I'm not actually golfing with you guys, I need to get back to work." And I said, "Your team thinks that you're gone for the day. Let them think you're gone for the day. Like, take some time for yourself." He couldn't. He believed that unless he was showing his team in some way that he was working nonstop, that that he felt guilty about it.
Yeah.
And I imagine that speaks to what you were just saying about working longer hours, showing people how hard we're working. And I do believe, obviously, the show is called Effort Over Results. I believe in effort, but I feel like it was almost performatory, just to show his team that, like, look how hard I'm working. I'm the owner, I'm the CEO, I need to do this. Is that resonating with what you were just saying?
Yeah, that sense that you have to earn, your
Hi.
success
Yeah.
and your title, and you can but if you're feeling not quite good enough, you're feeling like you always have to earn it, you can't slack off for a minute because that would prove that you're not good enough, right? And or maybe you set your expectations so high that if you didn't work that hard, then you wouldn't feel like you'd earned earned that role and that right title. Yeah.
Yeah. What are some of the biggest misconceptions people have about imposter syndrome today?
Well, we talked about the gender one, so it's definitely a gender issue. Another one is that it's their personality. You know,
Mm.
it's really only been discussed in social media in the last 15 years. Before that, it was just an obscure research topic, really. Um, but it's got so now that people say, "Oh, that's my imposter syndrome," and leave it at that. Yes,
Yeah.
and 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 so there's this idea that it's your personality, it's who you are, which means there's nothing you can do about it. Which for me is pretty disheartening because it means you're helpless, you're stuck, and it reinforces that idea that maybe you're not good enough. So this is definitely a misconception
Mhm.
that that it's your personality, and it's absolutely not. There's a sense of isolation with it because it feels like everybody else is doing so well.
Mhm.
You've got these internal feelings, like you don't see other people's internal feelings, so you think it's just you, and it's over 70% of high achievers.
Mhm.
Um, and then the other one is that it's a beginner's issue, and I do see a lot of influencers who say, "Well, just plug and get more experience, do this," and this is why I speak to 45-year-olds because they've tried that and it doesn't
Right.
work, because 'cause they've got that experience, they've got their outer success, right? They don't need to do they're already got everything they need, but what they need to do is to develop that inner success so that they can feel it and get satisfaction from it, right? And so not only getting rid of imposter syndrome and feeling deep self-acceptance, not only does it improve your performance and make that performance easier, but it brings this sense of yes, that's a job well done. And in full humility, pat yourself on the back and go, yeah, I like that. So you say about, things that we can tell our children. I get this question a lot then. What it's like, oh my gosh, I'm teaching this to my children. What can I do? Well, let's separate out as much as you can, and this goes for yourself as well as your children, your worth from what they do. So instead of being the judge of your child's work, saying, oh, that's good or that's not good, ask, did you enjoy that?
Mm.
Would you do it differently another way? Did you have fun? These questions, and making them the person who decides on the value of that experience.
Mm.
That is a way that we can separate that.
That there one of the chapters in my book that'll be coming out around Christmas is effort over results and how to raise more resilient children. And and it speaks to my experience with my two children and how I felt that, once again, there's no parent's handbook, but I felt that we had, now looking back, we had, for lack of a better term, screwed up with our daughter in telling her how great she was all the time, because she was naturally talented, but unfortunately she ended up with probably imposter syndrome and a fear of adversity, right?
Mm.
So I'm going off on how do we I want to stay on the children thing, and I know you don't work with children, but let me dig into this a little bit. How do we raise stronger children, in terms of this entire thing, that their worth is not conditional, that, but you don't want to raise them weak either. And I love how you said when they complete something, not saying, oh, you did so well on that and how good they are. You talk about the journey, you talk about, how they feel about it. Explain that a little more.
So really what you're doing is you're changing this pervasive idea that is throughout a society that that their value, or rather your approval of them, right? So this is where their idea of value comes from. Your approval versus disapproval. What do you admire in them? What do you dislike in them? And kids don't take that as approval or dislike of what they've done. They take it as approval or disapproval of who they are.
Right.
So even though, so, for all parents, don't beat yourself up over this, right? This isn't, they don't realize what you're trying to tell them. And they take it as, this is about me as a person. When I do something you don't like, I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. And it feels like, and I know this sounds very harsh, but it feels like I'm not loved.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and for a child, particularly a young child, they're completely dependent on adults for their survival. And if a child is not considered worthy of
Mhm.
care, love, and attention, they will die, right? And there's studies being done. So it taps into this primal fear. I was talking about the unconscious primal fear. If I'm not good enough, I will die. And that is that viral meme, that viral mental belief that practically everybody carries. So when you say, well, what can I do as a parent to help the children? Absolutely separate their worth from their actions. Absolutely everywhere. But
Very
the
tough
other
to
thing,
do.
very hard to do. It really is. One of the reasons why it's so hard to do is because we're operating from a point of view where they're the same.
Yeah.
So the best advice I have for a parent is to work on yourself first. The oxygen mask
Yes,
in the
Kevin
plane, yeah.
Lawrence.
Put
Yes.
your mask on first. Yeah, and it's really true because you're not only teaching your children by what you tell them, you're modeling for them what it is to be an adult. And if you're modeling an adult is self-critical and an adult is overworking and an adult is constantly stressed, that's what they understand being an adult means. So I've seen this with the clients that I work with, when they get to that deep self-acceptance, when they've let this whole idea go, their relationships, not only with their partners and their families, change, but with their children. And their children start to respond in a different way that is more effortlessly confident, that is not doubting themselves, that's really just accepting and happy with who they are. And that is the real legacy in this work.
That. Um, it it's so hard in today's social media society to get children to believe in themselves and that their actions are not who they are.
Mhm.
And I mean, it literally is it's a nonstop chase to be somewhat famous, to get likes. Likes and retweets are the currency of the day. And it's so hard and you can model it properly in your own home, but these children are being more or less raised by their phones and by their friends. Now, I would suggest that even when we were younger, our friends were a great influence on us because that's who our closest, circle of influence was.
Yeah.
But how, yeah, I feel like I don't want to go down this rabbit hole because we could talk for hours on it. But I love what you said about trying to teach children that their worth, it's not conditional. That whether they're a good student or not, or good athlete or not, or like you said before, if you do good things, you're a good person. If you do bad things, you're a bad person, and how you disconnect those. Um, I'm sure you talk about a lot of this in your two books. I want to dig into the books for a second.
Sure.
So, Outsmart Imposter Syndrome,
Yes.
one of your titles, you had mentioned that the inner critic. And we all have it. We all have that person, that inner critic is a protection mechanism. And maybe you touched on this before, but how does that work? And how do we reframe that? That it's not a protection mechanism.
Yeah, well, the inner critic is driven by the amygdala, right? The amygdala is saying, "This is dangerous," right? So you should not do that,
The
right?
brain's designed to help us survive, right? First and
Yeah,
foremost.
the brain's designed to help us survive, but it automatically, so we're getting into the neuroscience here, so it automatically creates a list of dangers that
Mm,
it's perceiving, dangers. And when anything has a strong emotional charge attached to it, it flags that as a danger. So a particular event, it stores memories, but they call them fear memories, a combination of a strong memory tagged onto the actual factual memory,
mhm,
so that when it's looking out for similar things and it receives something similar either to the emotion or to the factual memory, it triggers that. So what we want to do, and this is the work we do, is to take away that trigger, or take away the flag of that trigger.
mhm.
And when that flag of that trigger is taken away, then it simply doesn't bother you. And so I'll give you an example. Let's say you're in a meeting and somebody gets really riled up. They go into fight mode. They start getting a bit pointed and then maybe a bit aggressive and maybe start shouting. And this is not unusual in business meetings. It's
Yeah.
shocking and unfortunately not unusual. Now, when somebody's nervous system gets triggered like that, it triggers everybody else's nervous system, because their nervous system is saying, there is danger here. I'm responding to some danger, and everybody else's nervous system goes, oh, yeah, danger, right? So you can see how things escalate. If you see that person getting angry and it doesn't trigger your nervous system, then you can look at them and go, gee, they've got to be pretty stressed. Clearly, there's something going on for that person to make them so stressed. I wonder what it is.
Mm.
And so the way that you respond changes. You start to become curious about how to help them. You staying calm, your nervous system being calm, communicates to them, hey, there's no danger here. And that will actually help calm them as well. And so the shift then in terms of how you respond to people is dramatic. And you staying calm means that you are, in control. You don't get reactive. There's a study from the USADA Business School in Spain. They looked for transformational leaders. How can they identify them? And so they put some MBA students through these tests, and they monitored who said what and when and how, and they wired up their brains for their EEG, they wired up their body for their vital signs. And their conclusion was that the really impactful transformational leaders are not the ones who have the most airtime, not the ones who are most eloquent, not the ones with the best ideas, but they're the ones that keep their nervous system calm, can regulate their nervous system.
Is that emotional intelligence?
Regulating, no, actually, emotional intelligence is self-awareness and self-management,
Mm, okay.
other awareness and other management. So it's emotional intelligence is more around the emotions. We're talking about the triggered nervous
Trigger.
system
Okay.
response, the fight, flight, freeze. Yeah. So the people who can keep themselves calmer. And so when we take away those triggers, or take them out of the amygdala's list of dangers,
Mm.
then they are no longer triggered. And so the world changes because you're not reacting to other people's triggered nervous systems. You act with compassion, talk about compassionate leadership with boundaries. You want to help people. You naturally mentor people, and you stay calm, and you become this impactful leader because you're not driven into a frenzy by a crisis.
I have noticed, since I've done a lot of research and studying and content consumption over, not just effort over results, but really just how people react in certain situations, and even going through my own, um, discussions with counselors and people who have knowledge in this area. I note when you described that scenario, I pictured myself in that room and how I would have reacted 5 years ago or um older, meaning I probably would have been triggered.
Mm,
I'm very emotional. My friends and family know this. I show that vulnerability, which is good, and sometimes maybe not so good. But definitely, I get triggered emotionally. It comes from my childhood. It comes from being in a single parent family and what we went through. And I'm just learning in the past year or two how to be, as Ted Lasso would say, be curious, not judgmental, right?
mm,
And not just immediately going to what's wrong with this person, right? And a saying we have here in North America, throw them under the bus in
mhm.
terms of, well, I've given up on this person because they're obviously just an emotional wreck and I don't want to deal with them. Um, but it's interesting because now when I see these things happen and when I hear stories, when my wife comes home from work and she tells a story of a coworker that, you know, got emotional or got upset, the first question I ask her or the person that's telling me the story, it's like, huh, I wonder what was going on in their lives that day. Understanding, there's always a background. And now actually now this reminds me of when I was a secondary teacher, high school teacher, and the children that I encountered on my day-to-day teachings and kids who would act up in class, kids who would fall asleep in class, they didn't hand in their homework, they had disregard for authority. And then my reaction was, well, this kid's a write-off, forget about them, I can't help them. After I left teaching, and now this is 20 years later, and I look back and I really regret the way I handled certain situations because I now look back on that, and it took having my own children to help me with this, Tara. But I look at those children and I go, what the heck was going on in their lives that day or in their life in general that made them do what they did, meaning never hand in homework. They failed the class. They would act up in class. They would, bully other students. I wish it wouldn't have taken me so long to see that and to have, but now I feel like, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. And now the best time is now.
Yeah,
And that's what I want to try to continue building in myself is just as you explained it in whatever setting, if something or somebody or a situation is getting a bit escalated,
yeah,
to handle it with calmness and 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 be able to breathe through it.
yeah.
And it's easier said than done, for sure,
Mhm.
especially when you've spent, for me, 50 years reacting emotionally.
Well,
So,
here's why
yeah,
it's easier said than done, Quinn,
okay.
because,
Help me with
um
this. Yes.
yeah. So all the information from your senses comes in through your nerves and your brainstem, and before they go up to the thinking part of your brain, they pass by the amygdala.
Mm,
And when your amygdala gets triggered, it's already too late. You can't kind of mindset or think your way out of a triggered nervous system. You have to then calm it down. So the only way to get that effortless acceptance and effortless non-judgmentalism is to eliminate the trigger in the first place. And this is why the work that I do with people is so powerful, because by eliminating the trigger, it means they're not having this automatic reaction to it. Because once it's triggered, it's done. There's a few brilliant ways you can get calm again quickly, and this is what I also teach. But the ideal, right, is to not get triggered in the first place. That will allow you to be calm, and then that makes it easy, really easy.
are there any quick fixes for imposter syndrome?
Um, so the best tip that I have, right, so the fix to imposter syndrome is get rid of the root cause. This is
Okay.
exactly what we're talking about. Um, what can help to just dial things down a bit, dial that stress.
Mm,
One of the most common behavior patterns in imposter syndrome is comparing, where you
mm.
compare yourself. I mentioned it already. Everybody else's outside success with your in.
Comparison is the thief of joy.
Thief of joy, 100%. Well, so comparison is already one of these things that the brain does to protect you, right? You're walking along a familiar environment. Your brain's always looking out for the differences, so it can spot a potential danger. That's a snake, right? That's new, right? And so we're always, so we can't stop comparing, right? Because our brain is doing what it's supposed to do and looking out for danger. However, when you notice yourself comparing, realize that you're looking for differences, flip it and start looking for similarities.
Mm.
How am I the same as that person? What's the similar backgrounds we have, even foods we like, and anything at all, right? Music that we like to listen to. And the more similarities you find with the people around you, the more you'll feel like you belong, the more you'll feel like part of them. And the less isolated and alone and different you feel. So that's probably the fastest thing that you can do absolutely anywhere.
Excellent. I love that. Is imposter syndrome ever a good thing? Like, can it be reframed as something useful?
And my answer to that is
Challenge.
the short answer is no,
Okay.
right? And the slightly longer answer is imposter syndrome is like having a nail in your shoe
Mm.
that you don't know is there. So every time you take one step, it's painful, it slows you down, and it's very frustrating, and it makes you miserable. I've heard some people say, is imposter syndrome a good thing? It means you care. And you can say this, okay, a nail in your shoe, you're walking along. Well, aren't you brave and strong for fighting through this pain and managing to walk anyway? Right? Well, yes. But well, let's just take the nail out. Let's just, yeah, there is no I'm a better person because I'm experience imposter syndrome. It's true, a genuine imposter doesn't care what other people think, right?
Mm.
Someone who's genuinely like a con man or something like that, someone who's trying to con other people around them and be a genuine imposter. They don't care what other people are thinking. So for people with imposter syndrome, they do absolutely care. But just because they care doesn't mean imposter syndrome's a good thing.
Yeah,
You
because I
know?
would think there's a level of humility that comes with imposter syndrome. How did I get here? I'm not good enough, so I need to keep proving myself for the position that I currently hold. And so a certain amount of humility is there. And for some, I would think that you've maybe even encountered some executives that use imposter syndrome almost as motivation. It's like I don't feel good enough, so I'm going to use this to prove to people and not just prove to them I'm good enough, but also help this company succeed, this team succeed through my efforts. No matter how much it kills me, I'm going to continue to do that. And I'm not trying to twist it, Tara, and say that imposter syndrome is a positive thing, but some people might reframe it that way in their own situation, and that it helps them. Have you ever encountered someone you've worked with, an executive that has said that they use imposter syndrome almost as fuel?
Yeah, absolutely. I get that fairly often. And I respond to it like this. Firstly, if you have imposter syndrome, you're not working at your best, right? You're stressed, you've got nagging doubts, you're overworking, you haven't got such, your IQ's 13 points lower, your creativity is 50% lower, you're doing, some of these behaviors. This isn't you at your best. So if somebody's really successful and they feel driven by imposter syndrome, they're actually underperforming according to what they can do. So it's not making them perform better. Now, if it's driving them to prove it, there are two motivations. One driver is pain. It's the carrot and the stick. One driver is pain, and the other is adventure. Right. So
Mm.
if they recognize that they're driven by pain, it doesn't mean that that's the only way they would have got there. And that when we get rid of the pain of this and the pain driver, what we're left with is that human spirit of, I wonder if I can do this, or wouldn't that be cool to try without the who am I to possibly think of doing that? And this is what I see with all my clients, that although a lot of them were driven by the pain of having to prove themselves to other people or prove themselves to them, what they find is that there's a a joy in their work rather than that stress in their work. When they get rid of imposter syndrome, challenges are an adventure and something to explore. And so they don't say, oh, well, that pain's not there. I'm going to go and sit on a hammock in a beach and sip Mai Tais. They don't. They don't do that, right? They remain people who are interested in having an impact, making a contribution, and they're absolutely delighted that they can now do this to an even higher standard with more ease and with more joy and satisfaction. So yeah, if pain has been the driver, then imagine what life could be if the pain wasn't there and you were driven by the thrill of the challenge instead.
Mhm, mhm. Your second book, Unmasking: The Coach's Guide to Imposter Syndrome.
Yeah.
Um, and a lot of coaches now watch this podcast, and even myself as a coach. Um, what what mistakes do you feel? Because I would think that no matter what philosophy you bring to your client as a coach, especially if you're in the business world and dealing with executives and high achievers, you're going to encounter imposter syndrome probably quite a bit. Okay, let's be real about that. But what mistake do coaches often make when trying to help clients with imposter syndrome? Maybe it's initially, or they handle it wrong. And I know you're not trying to judge other coaches necessarily, so I don't want to put you in an awkward position. But what are some mistakes coaches may make initially with people who have imposter syndrome?
Here's some things I've seen other coaches report as things that are helpful, and they can be helpful, but they don't resolve imposter syndrome. One is thinking that the problem is confidence, and somebody just needs building up their confidence. But when people are at a high level of achievement, they already understand logically, intellectually, that they're capable and competent. So it's not that they're lacking confidence. So it's not low self-esteem. Sometimes they talk about, well, let's highlight your strengths. Right? I mean, you're not just acknowledging what your strengths are, but the same thing. They can logically list, yes, I can do this, I can do that, do that. But internally, they've still got this, yeah, but it's not quite enough. So approaching the symptoms by themselves can help a little bit, but not much. In 2020, there was a meta study done of like the last 40 years of research into imposter syndrome. Right, so they did this all the research and collated it and came back. And in 2020, they said there is no published solution to imposter syndrome, which is shocking. Like there's
Mm,
all this discussion of it, and who gets it and when and
mm.
why, but no solutions. Of course, that prompted a flurry of people publishing here's our solution, right? And so there's basically four different things. One is some online training, which gave a 20% improvement, and then coaching that gave about 26% improvement. So this was good. And then there was a self-compassion training, which got a 30% improvement.
Hmm.
And then there's addressing the root cause, which is the work that I do, that gave a 68%
Wow.
improvement. That's the difference in terms of addressing the symptoms and addressing the root cause. So the self-compassion is partway there, it's getting there, but it's a bit more again. It's getting to that level of deep, not just self-compassion, but self-acceptance.
Is is getting to the root causes now exploring their past and potentially their upbringing, the household they grew up in, the environments they grew up in? Is that what you mean by root causes, or can it mean different things?
The root cause is that fundamental belief that our worth it depends on what we do, that our worth
Okay.
is conditional. That's it. And the way that we do it is we take away the layers. So I said, say imposter syndrome is like this ball, this idea, and then every incident that we have, that the comment from the particular person who, for your brother-in-law, right, they add on, so they layer onto that, so they lock it in the brain as this is true. The brain has all this evidence. What we do is we unpick those, and we're not, and it's definitely not therapy. It's we don't go that deep. We use a particular way to take off the tag in the amygdala that this is a danger, and so we let it go. It's a letting go, right? So we let one go, let go, another go. When you go do a few of those, then it softens that hard knot, if you like.
Mm.
And what it does is it allows the brain to be, oh, well, maybe my worth doesn't depend on what I do. And that's the unconditional worth. That's that deep level of self acceptance.
That still strikes me as such a hard um, concept for people to grasp because the world is built to drive into us that our worth is based on what we do.
It's completely unconscious.
Even
That's why
even
it's hard.
every generation, it's been about, having a job and a career. It's during the depression in the 30s, men feeling worthless because they couldn't provide for their families. Everything we encounter in life is about providing to others to and providing some form of worth. We even talk about being a contributing member of society. And that's what we want our children to be, is to grow up and be good contributing citizens. And but that all just speaks to that worth. Your worth is basically it's a currency. And
It's
how do you get away with that without it becoming a woo-woo kumbaya sort of approach? How do you find that beautiful line that allows people to not that to think that they're good enough? And I've heard this a
yeah,
lot in psychology. It's like you're good enough
yeah,
without them just backing off completely and going, "Oh, well, if I'm good enough, I can sit on the couch and eat Cheetos and watch TV all day."
yeah. That's
Right?
but that's yeah, I totally get that, and that's just not how people respond to it. So the
Okay.
first part of it, right? How do we even see this as a valid idea? Okay, when a baby is born, right? It is completely worthy, right? It is a miracle. It was a joy, right? And it doesn't need to do anything. It doesn't
Yeah.
need to prove anything. It doesn't need to smile and even look cute, right? Nothing. It's inherently worthy. And this is true for humans at every stage of their life. There's an inherent worth in who we are, inherent worth in that humanness that we have. So that is what we're getting back to. And the deep self acceptance comes from removing the triggers that I mentioned, the triggers in the brain, because then if somebody criticizes you, you don't automatically think that must mean I'm terrible.
Yeah.
Right? And it doesn't trigger you at the very primal level to say, I'm going to be rejected and I'm going to die. So when you don't have that automatic reaction, then what you do instead, you think, that's an interesting idea. I wonder why they said that. And you
Hmm.
see how it just changes it. So it's not like we're trying to be any different. It comes out automatically because we're not being dragged back to that fight, flight, and freeze state again and again and again.
Is the term well, not term, when we talk about, once again, your worth is conditional, I think of expectations, right? And for example, as a parent, the expectations we have of our children and the high expectations we put on our children probably from day one,
Mhm.
in most cases, where it's like, and it seems to stem from, you know, as parents, you don't want the child to embarrass themselves, embarrass the family. Like if they're failing classes, if they're getting, running with the wrong circles, if they're doing things. But even for the most generic of families, like, and okay, I'll use mine for example, and my kids hate it when I expose them like this, but like, we had certain expectations for my children, but I think a lot of that came from, obviously, from my childhood upbringing. And any therapist and counselor worth their salt is going to talk about childhood trauma in some form that creates who you are as a parent. And I go back to that term, but the expectations. And here's the point I'm getting to, Tara, is that it took me too many years, I'll admit that. But when I stopped laying expectations on my children in terms of their university, in terms of their athletic career, in terms of who they were, even just in society, and this is only recently. Like I said, I regret that it's taken me this long, but when I finally stopped, and what really inspired me was the Mel Robbins let them theory. Um, but when I just decided to let them and make their own choices and have zero expectations on them, gosh darn it, if they didn't blossom from that, if they didn't grow from that, being able be having the autonomy, and this I do speak to this in my book even about the autonomy we need to give our children, not so much autonomy that they can run wild in the streets. There still needs to be guardrails,
Yeah.
but the autonomy to figure out who they are, the autonomy to make many mistakes and learn from them. Generation X, um, hyper helicoptered parented their kids. Sorry, it
Mhm.
just is the way it is,
Yes.
and we protected them from everything. And we engaged their teachers and their coaches and the people who were treating them wrong, so to speak, and we created this almost like bubble boy. We almost created this entire generation of bubble children who had high expectations put on them, but then the parents basically wrote the roadmap for them.
Mm.
Is this going to create a future generation of more clients for you, so to speak? Because my children now, I mean, they're Gen Z, but they're 22 and 25. Is this going to create now a future Gen Z adult generation of even worse imposter syndrome?
It's quite possible.
Mm,
However, we teach our children what we believe.
mhm,
We believe what we believe because our parents taught us
mm,
and because their parents taught them. So you can see this pattern, although we make changes and adjustments, there's still some fundamentals. And one of the fundamentals that's being passed down is that your worth depends on what you do. What you did with your children in dropping the expectations was fantastic. Because what you stopped saying was, in order for you to be worthy, you have to look like this. This picture, this in this box, and that has to be you. That is a very, very powerful thing to do, really let them be,
mhm.
let them grow. When you change who you are, not who you are, when you get really back to who you really are, I think that's a better way of putting it. When you drop that particular belief, then you open things up. I mean, parents, and none of this is to blame parents, right? You're doing the best you can, and
Yeah,
you're passing on your beliefs unconsciously as well as consciously. But in essence, that was the best you had, right? That's the best you had. So that self acceptance for for the parents is that's the best you had. If you knew a better way of doing it, you would have done it, right?
right?
And if you knew it sooner,
Yeah.
you would have done it sooner. So that, beating ourselves up for not having done it sooner, we can drop that. There's no need for that.
Mm,
But the shift when you allow a child to not have that expectation. Fundamentally, the reason we have expectations, right? Bottom line is we want our children, to be happy.
yeah,
That's it.
yeah,
We want them to be happy, enjoy their lives, feel love, feel joy, feel community, and if they achieve something and get satisfaction from that, fantastic. So the driver to create the expectations is a positive one, right?
mm,
It just wasn't the best one. There are better ways, but at the time you didn't know, so that was you doing the best. So this is some of the elements of self-acceptance in
yeah.
here. Everybody's doing the best they can with the resources they have, and if they knew a better way of doing it, they would absolutely do it.
Wow. Yeah, and I, as a parent who is only once again recently, and I wish I'd learned this sooner, but who knew, who number one, was this information around 25 years ago? A, B, was I really open and willing to accept that information then? And I believe everything happens for a reason. So now I'm being exposed to this, and it's making me a better parent now, and probably an even better grandparent in someday. Um, but yes, it is that expectations that, and once again, like I said before, as parents, we're not given a handbook. There's no perfect handbook of being a parent. I would, if I were to give one piece of information to parents now that I'm 54 years old, and to young parents to say is, let your kids mess up, let them make mistakes. give them a little more rope than you normally think you should, to let them figure out who they are. Because that's really what we spend the first 18 years or maybe longer of our lives doing, is trying to figure out who we are. How do we fit into this big picture? And how do we become our authentic, genuine selves? And I think we've gone through multiple generations of people who have had to put a mask on, to fit into their workplace, to their circles of influence, to the teams they play on in the educational system, and there needs to be that unmasking of people's genuine, authentic selves. And I believe you speak to that in your book about masking and unmasking. And what is what does that mean? Like when it comes to the masking, is what I'm saying, like how could a coach, or how can you spot when, a client is masking their imposter feelings?
Very, very hard. One of the aspects of imposter syndrome is secrecy. People keep it a secret. They believe that it's their personality, that they're alone, and it's just them,
Yeah.
and there's nothing they can do. So it's quite hopeless in terms of that. But and so people don't share that. And it's starting to change, right? People are more talking about it, but people generally don't share it. So what I have is a quiz. It's 20 questions. It's actually one of the original researchers back in 1978, Pauline Clance. She put it together, so it's a gold standard for imposter syndrome test. So it's this quiz, 20 questions, and then you get a score. And if you get over 50%, then imposter syndrome is present. If you get over 62%, this is another piece of research, then it's having enough of an impact that it's going to benefit you to do something about it.
Is this set of questions available online?
Yes, I can give you a link. We can put it in the show.
Okay. Let's put them in the show notes for sure. Yeah, it'd be good to be self-diagnosed. I know I'm going to get above 60%. So let's just call a spade there. How do organizations and businesses, if they don't necessarily implement coaching, or they bring in an outside third party to coach their people, how do they build a culture that helps people maybe lean away from their imposter syndrome, or help them grow as people to believe in that what they're doing is I don't want to say good, but like that, once again, that their worth isn't necessarily connected to, their actions. But how do you create a culture of non-imposter syndrome in the workplace?
That's harder without actually addressing imposter syndrome,
Right.
because but there are several things you can do. So
Mhm.
we've talked about how one of the problems with imposter syndrome is it keeps triggering the nervous system, right? And that keeps us at a lower performance than we're capable of. And nervous systems communicate to each other. So if a group of people are tense, then the people around them are tense as well. So it fosters that. So absolutely, making sure that there is no toxicity in the workplace. Right, absolutely making sure that there's no bullying going on, all of these things that could trip the nervous system.
Mhm.
Here's a really good thing you can do in helping people feel like they belong,
Mhm.
is at the start of a meeting, get everyone to just say one thing, like a little check-in. It doesn't have to be, anything fancy, but just getting people's voice into the room
Mhm.
to make them feel like they belong. Um, Looking at what you're modeling, um, is really important as well. Burnout is very closely linked to imposter syndrome. The researchers found this correlation. I had one client who had a technical team of 70, and he said he was riding the edge of burnout, and he felt he was managing it, but it was only just, hanging on by the edge of his teeth. He had a 10% rate of burnout in his tech team
Mhm.
because his tech team were looking at his work patterns, and he's getting in earlier and staying up later and is always tense and driven. And they're seeing it again, just like parents and children, but your employees are saying, that's our senior leader. That's clearly how we need to get on in this culture. So be very mindful of what you're communicating by the example of your behavior.
I would think that goes back to my example earlier of the client that I worked with that said, he couldn't stay at the golf course because he had to get back. And he wants to model what he wants his employees to do. And so his modeling is, or his at least his thought process was, if I'm not working hard 24/7, my team will think that's okay to not work hard 24/7. And that it create and it's interesting because that was his belief, and it's hard to get him to sway from that.
Really, and see, the thing is, if he's got that belief, then he's overworking. He's going to be triggered all the time, so he's working at a lower performance level already.
Um,
Yeah, and he's going to be not as efficient because if he's got this constant nagging voice saying, "Yeah, he's distracted, he's not so focused." So actually, he's not that 24/7 work ethic is not the best way to get the best results. So that would be where I would challenge it, right at that assumption that that is the best way to get the best out of people. The way to get best out of people is to be not triggering their nervous systems, not judging them for what they do, separating out their worth and their actions, making them feel included.
mhm. Here's the irony. You and I both referenced Kevin Lawrence's book, Your Oxygen Mask, first. And that day, I had actually given copies of that book to everybody at the table. He walked out without his.
Yeah.
Like the signs are all there, right? Um, don't worry, I drove to his place of work and I dropped it off. but but interesting the mindset.
Yeah, and some people, I mean, I think this is another of the reasons that the average age of my clients is 45,
Yeah,
because it's by then that they realize this been repeated pattern that's been dragging them down and holding them back,
yeah,
and they don't know what to do about it. And but it sometimes comes to something like, and I have had clients who've come having had burnout and having had to leave their work, leave their career, leave their entire profession. Clients who have, because they get triggered in the fight so much, they've burnt bridges and they've lost opportunities, they've lost business. People who, because they're not speaking up and putting themselves forward enough, they're not quoting for contracts and not getting what they're capable of, and they're underselling in their business. So they see it either in terms of their own health or their career, or in terms of their business, that much disruption, and then they finally get to a point with something has to change, and that point is different for everyone.
have you ever done group work with a company?
So I do group talks.
Okay,
But the work to actually eliminate imposter syndrome is a one-to-one
sure.
program. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a 90-day program, and it's one-to-one.
Yeah, I would think it would. Yeah, I mean, yeah, right. You can present the information as a group, or do a speaking engagement, maybe even a half-day workshop. But really, you're just presenting the information and answering questions. But you're right. To deal with imposter syndrome, you have to go straight to the head of the snake, which is individuals one to one. Uh,
And individuals at the top level. So I've worked with groups of executives on a one-to-one basis, or 3 founders on a one-to-one basis, each of those. And then that ripple effect
right.
is 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 huge, because everything everything changes when we drop imposter syndrome. We're not more self accepting of ourselves. We're accepting of other people. We can handle difficult people much, much better. We can communicate with compassion, but really hold really strong boundaries. So it's not permissive. So it's not permissiveness. It has that resilience without overworking. That calm under pressure means that the amount of challenge and even crisis you can handle positively is much increased. So yeah, the ripple effect of this work is enormous.
Yeah, I mean, you obviously there are people at middle management or even entry level workers that may have imposter syndrome, but like you're saying, to have that ripple effect, you start with the leaders who need to embody and exemplify their behaviors, and it will just have that effect down the chain.
Yes.
Um, yeah, so yeah,
This
that's go ahead.
Well, this is what this is my beef, if you like, with a lot of leadership books, because they'll say, oh, a leader, you need to be this, be that, be that. So you can hear the not do, be, right? Okay.
Mm,
Yeah, who you are, right? But they don't tell you how, right?
yeah,
They say you need to be compassionate and hold strong boundaries at the same time. And me, the engineering background. Okay, how?
yeah,
Let's go step by step
yeah.
exactly. And that's why I am so excited by the work that I'm doing, because
Mhm.
we've got a very structured, systematic science base. This is how you do that step by step, and it has this natural result.
I am I am so glad I came across you and your work. Once again, I truly believe that everything happens for a reason, and this has been serendipitous that our paths have crossed, and that I saw something in what you were saying on your website and through your profile and LinkedIn that really resonated and connected to what I'm trying to do with effort over results. And I truly believe that no matter what philosophy and approach we bring, there's all some form of intertwinement between them all. And there is definitely some great synergies between what I'm trying to teach, high achievers, and in all arenas, not just necessarily business, through effort over results, and what you're doing with what you're doing with imposter syndrome. It's been a wonderful discussion. I want to end on a few wrap-up questions here, maybe a little bit of rapid fire, to get a little bit of your background, your thought process, and what you're doing right now. So let's do a few more questions, and then we can wrap things up for the show. In the past, 12 to 18 months, what has been one of the more influential pieces of content you've consumed, or a book or a podcast that has had great influence on you?
Wow, that's a really hard question because I read a lot.
You can give multiple answers. I'm not
Well,
going to hold you to anything.
lots and lots of books. Well, one of the well, I guess the biggest book was uh about memory reconsolidation. And that is the process that we do. This is the science behind it. I talked about back in the 1950s, conditional worth got defined and identified as being like the root cause of all human suffering.
Mm,
In the 1950s, we didn't know the brain could change. At that time, we didn't know about neuroplasticity. We didn't
right.
know how to change. And only in the last 15 years has the science actually caught up and said, actually, parts of the brain can change and should change. And this is the neurochemical process that does it. And this is the step-by-step process that we can do to change it. Now, I came to my program through um, breadcrumbs. I say, there was first one and then another and then another and then another. And yeah, I'm putting things together and amalgamating things. And then I had a program that was getting these fantastic results. And then I found the explanation of the neuroscience, which for me was like, yes, this is just amazing.
I'm I'm blown away that, and it probably is largely because of the internet and the sharing of information. But I'm just blown away that neuroplasticity and the concept that the brain can change itself is only really a fairly modern, more recent discovery. And going back to the 1950s reference, that they didn't think the brain could change, hence a lot of the horrible experiments that went on. But um, that concept of growth mindset versus fixed mindset, the concept of or you brought up today, the amygdala and the parts of the brain that can be changed, and the anterior midcingulate cortex. It's all phenomenal information, and I'm so glad we've found this, because I think it's obviously going to change future generations. It's already changed me in terms of the research that I've done. So I love what you're doing with this, because I think everybody talks about imposter syndrome. I don't think a lot of people talk about how do you solve it, how do you address it, and how do you work with people. But now that we do know the brain can change, there are people like you, obviously, that are have that expertise to work with people one to one to help themselves with it, because it's out there, the term, and people understand it to a certain extent, but they don't know how to deal with it, right? Um, how is your your own relationship with success, because you obviously started in engineering, and this is I would suspect you would say this is a departure when you look at your career to something completely different, although my wife's family is all engineers, so I understand where your thought process comes from. But how has your own relationship with success changed since doing this work and discovering all this?
Yeah, that's brilliant. So when I was about 13, careers counseling, we were, what do you want to be when you grow up? What
To
do you do?
be.
Yeah, I do, but yeah. And I wanted to be a psychologist. That because I'm fascinated by people, I'm fascinated by the way people think, and I wanted to help people. Went home, told my family, and they said, "Oh no, no, you can't do that. There's not enough money in that. You have to do something, better." And because I could do science,
Oh,
I went into engineering. Then I had a 10-year diversion. I had a PhD in engineering. Yeah, with success in engineering as a director in a software company in Boston, Massachusetts.
mm.
So it's you could call a lot of that successful. But coming back to what my passion is, that felt so much better. So this was 25 years ago now. I retrained. I had a 4-year degree in holistic therapy and then started working with people. And the success that I experience these days is the joy of witnessing people, the end of the program, how much their lives have changed, how much happier they are, how much more productive, how much they're feeling they contribute more, the ripple effect. And it's absolutely beautiful. I can't imagine doing anything more productive and better with my life than that. So that for me is the success.
You didn't want to engineer software the rest of your life?
Funny that.
So what's next for you? Any new work, any new research projects, books you're writing, anything you're excited about that you want to let our audience know?
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
what I've been doing, so I was, I talked about the results we're getting, 68% improvement versus
Right.
the 20 to 30. So I was writing a paper and I got challenged on it. They said, what if this is just the therapist or the coach effect, right? What if you are just this genius that, it's just you. So
Mm.
I am training coaches, experienced coaches, how to run my program.
Hmm.
And I took one group through it last October, and then they've been working with clients. And what we're trying to prove is that they get the same transformation.
It's
So
not
we
the practitioner, it's the
the process,
application process. Yes. Excellent.
process. And we're starting to get our first set of results, which prove that it is the process, which is fantastic. I am right now just training up a new bunch of coaches. They need practice clients to take through this process, supervised by me. And you're very welcome. And I'm offering it at a massive discount because it's
For sure.
practice
Research.
discount. Yeah.
Yep.
So, but it is research as well. So yeah. So if anyone's interested in that, get in touch. As I said, this is right now, and we're in April 2025.
Hmm.
Um, so get in touch, and you could be able to go through this program, experience it for yourself, and contribute to the research base of humanity.
Wow. I don't want to say I'm tempted. I think I would actually divert some of the people that I know that I work with to that program, because like I said, and I think you know this, is that I would suggest that a high percentage, obviously, of executives and high achievers experience imposter syndrome,
Yes.
and being able to continue to do the research and studies that you and your group are doing, and to have more data points and more people to work with will just enhance what you're doing, and I love that. I want to see you continue to grow this field, because I think it's extremely important. This isn't just business. I believe this is something that goes across all demographics, and whether it could be business or education or athletics. There's athletes out there that have imposter syndrome. Absolutely. High performing athletes that have won championships and maybe at the top of their game and don't really understand how they got there or why they got there. Where can our listeners connect with you? Where can they grab your books, dive deeper into your world? Let's make sure we can promote you as much as possible today, Dr. Halliday.
Lovely. Thanks, Ken. So books are everywhere the books are sold. Amazon and your local booksellers. LinkedIn is where you can find me most on social media, Tara-Halliday-PhD. And then just email me, tara@completesuccess.co.uk, and I will
Well,
answer personally.
this has been my favorite interview so far. And it's largely because I geek out, I nerd out on this psychology stuff, and I want so badly to understand not only myself, but the world around me. And I think because of the fields that I play in terms of business and high performance, this is a critical conversation that everyone needs to be having. And once again, the research and study that you and your group are doing is phenomenal. So thank you very much for being here today. I hope to have you on a future show, maybe once a new book or a new study comes out. Maybe we'll talk about the data that you learned from these current group works that you're doing, and we'll go from there. Thank you very much, Dr. Halliday.
Thank you very much, Quinn. This has been fantastic. I've really enjoyed it as well.
Thank you very much.